Widow with a painful secret. A Comanche warrior cast out by his own people. Their worlds were never meant to collide, until survival demanded it. But when he looked into her eyes, something changed. What she whispered next would defy everything they both thought they knew. Thank you so much for watching, and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Fort Griffin, turning the air thick and shimmering with heat. It was the summer of 1867, and the small frontier settlement clung to existence on the edge of Comanche territory, like a fragile promise that civilization might someday take root in this harsh land. Elizabeth Morgan stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the general store, her pale blue cotton dress already clinging to her skin despite the early hour. She clutched a small bundle of supplies to her chest, her green eyes scanning the horizon with a mixture of hope and dread that had become her constant companion over the past 3 years. She was 23 years old, though the hardships of frontier life had etched faint lines around her eyes that made her appear older. Her auburn hair, pinned tightly beneath a simple bonnet, caught the sunlight in shades of copper and gold. Elizabeth had arrived in Texas as the young wife of a cavalry lieutenant, full of dreams about building a life in this untamed land. Those dreams had died along with her husband during a Comanche raid on a supply wagon 2 years ago. Since then, she had survived by working as a seamstress and occasionally helping the fort doctor tend to the sick and wounded. The other women in the settlement whispered about her, called her cursed, said no good man would take a widow with her history. Elizabeth had learned to hold her head high and ignore their cruel gossip, but the loneliness cut deeper than any words ever could. As she turned to head back toward her small cabin on the edge of the settlement, a commotion erupted near the fort gates. Soldiers were shouting and townspeople began rushing toward the entrance. Elizabeth's heart quickened. Commotion at the gates usually meant one of two things. Either a cavalry patrol was returning, or there was trouble with the Comanche. She set down her supplies inside the store and hurried toward the growing crowd, her curiosity overcoming her usual caution. When she reached the gates, she saw a sight that made her breath catch in her throat. A lone Comanche warrior sat astride a magnificent paint horse, his posture proud and defiant, despite being surrounded by nervous soldiers with rifles trained on him. He wore buckskin leggings and a vest decorated with intricate beadwork, his long black hair flowing freely past his shoulders. A single eagle feather was woven into his hair, and his face bore the strong, angular features of his people. But it was his eyes that held Elizabeth transfixed, dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with a calm assessment that bordered on fearlessness. "He says he wants to trade," Captain Morrison called out, his weathered face creased with suspicion. The captain was a hard man, shaped by years of fighting and mistrust. "Claims he has information about Comanche movements in exchange for supplies. Says his name is Nakai, means wanderer in their tongue." Elizabeth watched as Nakai dismounted with fluid grace, his movements suggesting a warrior's strength and control. He stood nearly 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders and muscular build evident even beneath his buckskin clothing. There was something different about him, something in the way he carried himself that set him apart from the few other Comanche warriors she had seen from a distance during her years at the fort. He did not have the burning hatred in his eyes that she had expected. Instead, there was a deep sadness mixed with determination. "Why should we trust anything you have to say, savage?" Morrison spat the words with contempt. Several soldiers murmured their agreement, their fingers tightening on their weapons. Nakai's eyes swept across the assembled crowd, and for a brief moment, his gaze locked with Elizabeth's. She felt a strange jolt run through her, as though he could see past her carefully constructed walls straight into her wounded soul. Then he turned his attention back to the captain and spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "My people are hungry. The buffalo grows scarce, and we cannot feed our children on pride alone. I offer knowledge for food, for medicine. This is not betrayal. This is survival." His voice was deep and resonant, carrying a dignity that made some of the soldiers shift uncomfortably. "There are war parties planning to raid the settlements to the south. I can tell you when and where. In return, I ask for flour, coffee, blankets, enough to feed my family through the winter." Morrison snorted. "Your family? You expect us to believe you'd betray your own people for a few supplies? Nakai's jaw tightened, and Elizabeth saw a flash of pain cross his features. I am already outcast. My wife died from the white man's sickness last winter. My children starve because the war chiefs refuse to see that our old ways are dying. I choose their survival over honor. That is the choice you have forced upon us. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Elizabeth felt tears prick at her eyes, recognizing in this proud warrior's voice the same desperate grief that had haunted her own sleepless nights. She understood what it meant to lose everything, to be forced to choose between pride and survival, to carry the weight of loss like a stone in your chest that never grew lighter. Captain Morrison was about to respond when Elizabeth found herself stepping forward, her voice cutting through the tension. Let him trade. Every head turned to look at her, and she felt her cheeks flush under the scrutiny, but she pressed on. If his information saves even one life, isn't it worth a few supplies? We have plenty in the storehouse. Mrs. Morgan, this doesn't concern you, Morrison said dismissively, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now. Elizabeth had earned a grudging respect among the soldiers for her tireless work nursing the wounded, and her opinion carried more weight than he wanted to admit. It concerns all of us if there are raids coming, Elizabeth replied firmly, surprising herself with her boldness. And if this man is willing to help prevent bloodshed, we should listen. Nakai's dark eyes fixed on her again, and this time she saw something shift in their depths. Recognition, perhaps, or gratitude. When he spoke, his words were directed at her rather than the captain. You have known loss. I see it in your eyes. You understand that sometimes there are no good choices, only less terrible ones. Morrison looked between them with growing irritation, but finally jerked his head in a curt nod. Fine, but you'll be watched every moment, and if this is some kind of trick, you'll hang before sundown. Private Jackson, take him to the storehouse. Mrs. Morgan, since you're so concerned about this savage's welfare, you can help oversee the supplies he receives. Make sure he doesn't take more than what's fair. Elizabeth nodded, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what had possessed her to speak up, but something about Nakai's quiet dignity and raw honesty had moved her in a way she couldn't explain. As she walked alongside the warrior and the nervous young private toward the storehouse, she was acutely aware of his presence beside her. The way he moved with such natural grace, the faint scent of sage and leather that clung to him, the controlled power that radiated from his frame. Inside the dim storehouse, Private Jackson stood by the door, his rifle held ready, while Elizabeth began gathering the supplies. Nakai watched her work, and after a moment of silence, he spoke quietly. Why did you help me? The others, they look at me and see only an enemy. Elizabeth paused, a sack of flour in her hands, and considered the question. Because I know what it's like to be judged for things beyond your control, to be blamed for tragedies you didn't cause. She met his eyes steadily. My husband was killed in a Comanche raid. The people here think I should hate your people, that I should want revenge, but I've seen enough death and suffering. All I want is for it to stop. Nakai was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. Your husband? He was a warrior? A soldier, yes. Lieutenant James Morgan. He was escorting a supply wagon when... She trailed off, the old pain rising in her throat. It doesn't matter now. He's gone. And I'm here. And we both have to find ways to keep living. You are stronger than you know, Nakai said softly. And there was such genuine respect in his voice that Elizabeth felt warmth spread through her chest. To lose your mate and still choose compassion over hatred, that takes great courage. As she handed him the supplies, their fingers briefly touched, and Elizabeth felt that same strange connection she had experienced earlier. There was something in this man's eyes that called to something deep within her, something that recognized a kindred spirit forged in the fires of loss and survival. She quickly pulled her hand back, suddenly aware of how inappropriate such thoughts were. How the entire settlement would condemn her if they knew the flutter in her chest had nothing to do with fear. Private Jackson cleared his throat nervously. Ma'am, the captain wants the savage's information now, before we let him leave. Nakai gathered the supplies into a leather pack, then turned to face the young soldier. He provided details about the planned raids, locations, timing, the number of warriors involved. Elizabeth listened, memorizing every word to relay to Captain Morrison later, but she found herself studying Nakai's profile as he spoke. The strong line of his jaw, the intelligence that shone in his dark eyes, the way his hands moved expressively as he described the landscape. When he finished, he slung the pack over his shoulder and looked directly at Elizabeth one last time. "Thank you, Elizabeth Morgan. You have shown me that not all whites are blinded by hate. That gives me hope that perhaps there can be peace someday, even if I do not live to see it." The sound of her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. Before she could respond, he strode past Private Jackson and out into the bright sunlight. Elizabeth followed, watching as he mounted his horse with effortless skill. The small crowd that had gathered parted nervously as he rode toward the gates, his bearing still proud despite the weight of exile and loss he carried. As Nakai disappeared into the shimmering heat of the Texas plains, Elizabeth felt an inexplicable sense of loss, as though something important had just ridden out of her life before she had even understood what it meant. She stood there long after the gates had closed, her hand pressed against her chest where her heart beat with unfamiliar urgency, wondering if she would ever see the proud Comanche warrior again, and surprised by how much she hoped the answer would be yes. 3 weeks passed since Nakai's visit to Fort Griffin, and Elizabeth found herself thinking about him far more than she should. His words echoed in her mind during the long, lonely evenings in her cabin, and she caught herself scanning the horizon whenever she ventured outside, hoping to glimpse a lone rider on a paint horse. The information he had provided proved accurate. Captain Morrison had successfully intercepted 2 raiding parties heading toward settlements to the south, preventing what could have been devastating attacks. Yet the captain refused to acknowledge Nakai's contribution publicly, dismissing it as luck or coincidence. Elizabeth knew better, and the injustice of it gnawed at her conscience. The autumn wind had begun to carry a chill when Elizabeth was awakened one night by urgent pounding on her door. She lit a lamp with trembling hands and opened it to find Private Jackson, his young face pale with anxiety in the flickering light. "Mrs. Morgan, we need you at the fort immediately. There's been an incident. A Comanche warrior was found wounded near the South Ridge. He's asking for you specifically, ma'am. Says his name is Nakai." Elizabeth's heart lurched. She grabbed her medical supplies and a shawl, following Jackson through the darkness toward the fort. Her mind raced with terrible possibilities. What had happened? Why would Nakai come back? And why would he ask for her? Inside the fort's small infirmary, she found Nakai lying on a cot, his bronzed skin slick with sweat and blood. A deep gash ran along his left side, and his breathing was labored. Captain Morrison stood nearby with several soldiers, their expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. Dr. Williamson, the fort's aging physician, looked up as Elizabeth entered, relief washing over his weathered features. "Thank God you're here, Elizabeth. I've cleaned the wound, but he refuses to let me treat him further until he speaks with you. He's lost a lot of blood and needs stitching immediately." Elizabeth approached the cot, her professional composure masking the turmoil inside her. Up close, Nakai looked even more striking than she remembered, despite his weakened state. His chest rose and fell with obvious effort, and pain had drawn tight lines around his mouth, but his dark eyes still held that same intelligence and dignity that had captivated her weeks ago. "Nakai, I'm here," she said softly, kneeling beside the cot. "What happened?" His eyes focused on her face, and despite his pain, something like relief flickered in their depths. "Elizabeth Morgan," he whispered, his voice rough. "I came to warn you. The war chiefs, they discovered I gave information to the fort. They have declared me traitor, sentenced me to death. But I learned something more dangerous. There is a large war party gathering, 50 warriors or more. They plan to attack Fort Griffin in 4 days at dawn. They know the soldiers sent patrols south. They know the fort is vulnerable." Captain Morrison stepped forward aggressively. "How do we know this isn't a trap? How do we know you're not leading us into an ambush?" Nakai's jaw tightened, and he tried to sit up but gasped in pain. Elizabeth gently pressed him back down, her hand lingering on his shoulder. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the solid muscle beneath her palm, and had to force herself to focus on his words rather than the inappropriate awareness coursing through her. "If I wanted to deceive you, I would not have taken an arrow from my own people trying to reach you, Nakai said through gritted teeth. 4 warriors tried to stop me from coming here. I killed 2, wounded the others, but 1 arrow found its mark. I rode 3 hours bleeding to bring this warning because despite everything, I do not wish to see more death. My children are with a cousin in a peaceful band far to the west. They are safe. I have nothing left to lose, but I would not see innocents slaughtered, white or Comanche. Elizabeth looked into his eyes and saw only truth there, raw and unadorned. He's telling the truth, Captain. I'd stake my life on it. That may be exactly what you're doing, Mrs. Morgan, Morrison replied coldly, but she could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. The captain was a hard man, but he wasn't stupid. If there was even a chance Nakai was right, he couldn't ignore the warning. Dr. Williamson needs to treat his wound immediately, Elizabeth said firmly, rising to face Morrison. And then we need to prepare the fort's defenses. If 50 warriors attack at dawn and we're not ready, everyone here will die. You know our garrison is undermanned right now. Morrison stared at her for a long moment, then at Nakai, who met his gaze without flinching, despite the pain etched on his face. Finally, the captain nodded curtly. Fine, treat him, but he stays under guard, and if this turns out to be a trick, I'll hang him myself. Jackson, get Lieutenant Parker and Sergeant Coleman. We have preparations to make. As the soldiers filed out, Elizabeth turned her attention to helping Dr. Williamson clean and stitch Nakai's wound. The warrior endured the procedure with stoic silence, though she saw his hands clench into fists and sweat bead on his forehead. She found herself wanting to comfort him, to ease his pain, and the intensity of that desire troubled her deeply. You didn't have to come back, she whispered as she helped bandage his side after the doctor had finished. Doctor, Williamson had stepped away to organize his medical supplies, leaving them with a moment of relative privacy. You could have taken your children and disappeared into the West, started a new life far from all this conflict. Nakai's eyes found hers, and she saw such profound emotion there that it took her breath away. I could not leave knowing what was coming. I could not leave knowing you would be here when the attack came. He reached up and with surprising gentleness touched her cheek. From the moment I saw you, Elizabeth Morgan, I recognized something in you that called to my spirit. You are like me, wounded but not broken, grieving but not defeated. In another life, in another world, perhaps we could have known each other differently. Elizabeth felt tears spring to her eyes at his words. She knew she should pull away, knew this moment of connection was dangerous and inappropriate, but she couldn't bring herself to move. I've thought about you every day since you left, she admitted in a whisper, the confession escaping before she could stop it. I told myself it was foolish, that there could never be anything between us. Our worlds are too different, the hatred too deep. But I couldn't stop thinking about the sadness in your eyes, the strength in your voice, the way you chose your children's survival over your pride. And I thought of you, Nakai replied, his thumb gently brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. I thought of your courage, your compassion, your green eyes that held understanding instead of hatred. I told myself I was a fool, that a white woman and a Comanche warrior could never. He stopped, wincing as pain shot through his side. Don't talk, Elizabeth said, placing her hand over his where it still rested against her cheek. Rest now. We'll face whatever comes tomorrow together. Over the next 3 days, Fort Griffin transformed into a fortress. Captain Morrison, whatever his personal feelings, took Nakai's warning seriously. Soldiers reinforced the walls, stockpiled ammunition, and prepared defensive positions. Women and children were moved to the most protected areas of the fort. Elizabeth found herself spending long hours helping with preparations while simultaneously tending to Nakai, who insisted on helping despite his injury. Against Dr. Williamson's protests, Nakai sketched detailed maps of the surrounding terrain, showing Morrison the most likely approach routes and suggesting defensive strategies. His knowledge of Comanche tactics proved invaluable, and even the most skeptical soldiers began to grudgingly respect his expertise. Elizabeth watched him work, admiring his dedication even as worry gnawed at her. His wound was healing, but slowly, and he was still weak from blood loss. On the evening before the expected attack, Elizabeth brought Nakai dinner in the small storage room where he was being kept under guard. Private Jackson, who had been assigned as his primary watchman, had developed a quiet respect for the warrior, and now gave them privacy, standing watch outside rather than hovering over them constantly. "You should eat something," Elizabeth said, setting down a plate of stew and cornbread. "You'll need your strength tomorrow." Nakai accepted the food with a nod of thanks but set it aside, his eyes searching her face. "Elizabeth, if the attack comes as I have foreseen, I will fight alongside the soldiers. But I need you to understand something. After this is over, I cannot stay here. The Comanche will never stop hunting me, and I will not bring that danger to you or this settlement. I will disappear into the territories where no one can find me." "No," Elizabeth said, the word escaping with more force than she intended. "You can't just vanish, not after everything. Not after—" She stopped, struggling to find words for the emotions churning inside her. "Nakai, I know this is impossible. I know society would never accept us, that both our peoples would condemn what I'm feeling. But I can't pretend anymore. These past few days working beside you, watching your strength and honor despite everything you've lost, I've fallen in love with you. I know it's foolish and dangerous and completely irrational, but it's true." The confession hung between them like a fragile bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Nakai stared at her, his expression unreadable, and for a terrible moment, Elizabeth thought she had made a horrible mistake. Then he stood, moving toward her with surprising speed despite his injury, and pulled her into his arms. "Elizabeth," he breathed against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you since the moment you spoke in my defense, since you looked at me and saw a man instead of a savage. I have loved you through every lonely night, knowing it was hopeless, knowing our worlds could never meet. But I cannot ask you to give up everything for me. You would lose your place here, your security, everything you have built." Elizabeth pulled back enough to look into his eyes, her hands framing his strong face. "Everything I've built is loneliness, and whispers and empty rooms. I don't want security if it means living without hope, without love, without you. If you'll have me, Nakai, I'll go with you wherever you need to go. We'll find a place where we can be together, where the past doesn't matter, where we can build something new." Before he could respond, before doubt or reason could intervene, Elizabeth rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but then Nakai's arms tightened around her and the kiss deepened, becoming a promise and a claim and a defiance of everything that sought to keep them apart. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, and Elizabeth saw her own wonder reflected in Nakai's dark eyes. "Then we will survive tomorrow," Nakai said fiercely, his forehead pressed against hers. "We will fight, and we will live, and we will find our future together. I swear this to you, Elizabeth Morgan. You are my heart now, and I will protect you with my last breath." They held each other as darkness fell outside, drawing strength from their connection, knowing that dawn would bring either death or deliverance, but facing it together rather than alone. Dawn broke over Fort Griffin with deceptive serenity, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed to mock the tension crackling through the settlement. Elizabeth stood on the ramparts beside Captain Morrison, her medical supplies prepared and her heart hammering against her ribs. Below, in the courtyard, soldiers took their positions with grim determination. Nakai stood among them, having convinced Morrison that his knowledge of Comanche battle tactics made him invaluable despite his injury. He had been given a rifle and placed near the main gate, where his expertise could guide the defense. Their eyes met across the distance, and Elizabeth felt the invisible thread connecting them pull taut. Last night's confession and kiss had changed everything. No matter what happened in the coming hours, she knew she could never go back to the empty existence she had endured before Nakai entered her life. She had finally found something worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, and she refused to let fear steal it away. "There," Lieutenant Parker called out, pointing toward the eastern ridge. "Movement in the tree line." Elizabeth's breath caught as she saw them. Dozens of Comanche warriors emerging from the forest like shadows given form, their painted horses moving with coordinated precision. Even from this distance, she could see the war paint adorning their faces and chests, could hear the beginning of their war cries carrying on the morning wind. 50 warriors, just as Nakai had warned. Maybe more. It was the largest force she had ever seen assembled, and terror clawed at her throat. "Steady, men!" Morrison shouted, his voice cutting through the rising panic. "Hold your positions, do not fire until my command." The warriors split into 3 groups, exactly as Nakai had predicted during the planning sessions. The main force charged directly at the gates while 2 smaller groups swept around the flanks, seeking weak points in the defenses. But Morrison had positioned his men according to Nakai's advice, concentrating firepower where it would matter most. Now, Morrison roared, and the fort erupted with gunfire. The battle became a chaos of smoke, noise, and violence. Elizabeth forced herself to stay calm, to focus on her role. Wounded soldiers began arriving at her position, and she threw herself into treating them with steady hands despite the fear coursing through her veins. Dr. Williamson worked beside her, their practiced coordination saving lives even as the fighting raged below. Through the smoke and confusion, Elizabeth's eyes kept finding Nakai. He fought with devastating efficiency, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy as he called out warnings and tactical advice to the soldiers around him. She saw him drop 3 warriors who had breached the outer defenses, saw him physically pull Private Jackson to safety when the young soldier froze in terror, saw him take command of a section of wall when the sergeant there fell wounded. The attack lasted nearly 2 hours, wave after wave of warriors testing the fort's defenses, but Nakai's intelligence and tactical guidance had prepared them well. Every ambush the Comanche attempted had been anticipated, every weak point reinforced. Slowly, inevitably, the attackers began to fall back, their losses too heavy to sustain the assault. A final war cry echoed across the plains, and then the remaining warriors melted back into the forest, carrying their wounded with them. An eerie silence fell over the fort, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crackling of small fires that had been started during the fighting. Elizabeth's hands shook as she tied off the final bandage on a soldier's arm, the adrenaline that had sustained her beginning to ebb. She looked frantically toward the gates, searching for Nakai among the smoke-stained, exhausted defenders. She found him leaning against the wall near the main gate, his face streaked with powder smoke and sweat, his borrowed rifle still clutched in his hands. Blood stained his side where his wound had reopened during the fighting, but he was alive, he was standing, and when his eyes met hers across the courtyard, the relief and love that flooded his expression made her heart soar. Elizabeth abandoned her post and ran toward him, propriety and caution forgotten. She threw herself into his arms, feeling them close around her with fierce strength despite his exhaustion and pain. Around them, soldiers stared in shock at the sight of the proper widow embracing the Comanche warrior, but Elizabeth didn't care anymore. Let them stare, let them whisper. She had nearly lost him, and she would not waste another moment hiding what she felt. "You're alive," she whispered against his chest, tears streaming down her face. "Thank God you're alive." "As are you," Nakai replied, his voice rough with emotion. "That is all that matters, that is everything." Captain Morrison approached them, his expression unreadable. Elizabeth tensed, preparing for condemnation or worse, but the captain simply stood there for a long moment, studying them both. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying a weight of acknowledgement that surprised her. "You saved this fort, Nakai. Saved every man, woman, and child within these walls. Without your warning, without your tactical knowledge, we would have been slaughtered." Morrison paused, seeming to struggle with what came next. "I owe you an apology. I judged you by your skin rather than your character, and that was wrong. You have more honor than many white men I've known." Nakai inclined his head slightly, accepting the words with dignity. "I did what was necessary to protect those who could not protect themselves. That is the duty of any warrior, regardless of what people they belong to." Morrison's gaze shifted to Elizabeth, noting how she still stood within Nakai's embrace, and his expression softened with something that might have been understanding. "Mrs. Morgan, you spoke for him when others would not. Your judgment proved sound. I suspect your judgment remains sound now, even if what you're contemplating will not be easy." Elizabeth lifted her chin, meeting the captain's eyes steadily. "I love him, Captain Morrison. I know what that means, what it will cost, but I've spent 2 years hiding from life, hiding from possibility, because I was afraid of more loss and more pain. I won't hide anymore. I won't lose this chance at happiness because society says it's improper. A ghost of a smile touched Morrison's weathered face. I suspect you'll face more than impropriety, Mrs. Morgan. But I've learned today that courage comes in many forms, and love might be the bravest form of all. He turned his attention back to Nakai. You said you planned to disappear into the territories. I assume that plan hasn't changed? It has not, Nakai confirmed. I am marked for death by my own people now. Staying here would bring danger to everyone, but I will not go alone. His arm tightened around Elizabeth. If she will have me, Elizabeth Morgan will be my wife in the ways of both our peoples. We will travel west into the territories where the old boundaries are breaking down, where men and women from different worlds are building new communities together. Morrison nodded slowly. There are settlements in New Mexico territory near Santa Fe, where such unions are not unheard of. Trading posts and missions where the rules are less rigid. It won't be easy, but it's possible. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, pressing it into Nakai's free hand. Payment for services rendered. There's enough gold there to buy supplies, horses, and safe passage through the territories. Consider it compensation for saving our lives. Nakai looked at the pouch, then at Morrison, respect and gratitude shining in his dark eyes. You honor me, Captain. I will not forget this kindness. Just keep her safe, Morrison said gruffly. And perhaps someday, when the wounds have healed on both sides, you can send word that you've built something good out there. Give us hope that this war doesn't have to last forever. Over the next 3 days, Elizabeth prepared for the journey that would change her life forever. She sold most of her possessions, keeping only what could be carried on horseback. The women of the settlement avoided her now, their earlier coldness transforming into outright hostility. She was called traitor, savage lover, and worse. But she also received unexpected support from some quarters. Dr. Williamson pressed medical supplies into her hands and wished her well. Private Jackson, whose life Nakai had saved during the battle, helped them acquire horses and camping equipment. Even a few of the soldiers who had fought alongside Nakai offered quiet words of respect and good wishes. On the morning of their departure, Elizabeth stood in her empty cabin for the last time, looking at the life she was leaving behind. It had been a life of survival, of going through the motions, of existing rather than living. She thought of James, her first husband, and silently asked his forgiveness for moving forward. But she knew he would have wanted her to be happy, would have wanted her to choose life over mere existence. Nakai appeared in the doorway, leading 2 horses laden with supplies. His wound was healing well, and strength had returned to his powerful frame. He wore a mixture of buckskin and cloth clothing, symbolizing the bridge he would forever walk between 2 worlds. When he looked at Elizabeth, his expression held such love and devotion that she felt her remaining doubts dissolve like morning mist. Are you ready, my heart? He asked softly, using the Comanche endearment he had taught her. Elizabeth took one last look around the cabin, then walked forward into the sunlight, into her future. I'm ready. I've never been more ready for anything in my life. They mounted their horses and rode through the fort gates one final time. Captain Morrison stood watching from the ramparts, and he raised his hand in farewell, a gesture of respect that few would have predicted weeks ago. Elizabeth returned the wave, then turned her face toward the west, toward the unknown territories where they would build their new life together. As they rode across the vast Texas plains, the autumn sun warm on their faces, Nakai reached across the distance between their horses and took Elizabeth's hand. I know you are giving up much to be with me. I know the path ahead will not be easy. There will be those who hate us for what we represent, who see our union as a betrayal of both our peoples. And there will be those who see us as proof that love can bridge any divide, Elizabeth replied, her fingers tightening around his. That hope can survive even the darkest times. We'll face the challenges together just as we face the battle together. I'm not afraid anymore, Nakai. For the first time in years, I'm not afraid of the future. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the landscape unfolding before them in shades of gold and brown and endless blue sky. Finally, Nakai spoke again, his voice carrying a note of wonder. In my language there is a word, Tanatsu. It means, to find something precious that you did not know you were seeking. That is what you are to me, Elizabeth. The answer to a question I did not know my heart was asking. You don't know my past, Elizabeth whispered, echoing the words she had once spoken when they first felt the pull between them. You don't know all the mistakes I've made, all the times I've been afraid, all the ways I'm broken. Nakai brought their horses to a stop and turned to face her fully, his dark eyes